Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua, with Dr. Daniel Cantey. As the modern order enters its apparent sunset, Dr. Cantey looks anew at the ancient scriptures to learn what they teach about man and his world. Here he is with today's episode.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Old Testament and the New Man. My name is Daniel Cantey. I am your instructor. Tonight we're going to be discussing the story of Abraham, but before beginning on that, I want to talk a little bit about the context of Abraham and the shift that we are making as we begin with his story. Up to this point, we've been discussing Genesis 1 through 11, which is known as the primeval history, as it talks about the ancient world prior to the creation of the people of Israel. And now we're going to be shifting to the big story, which is the creation of Israel. This is going to be the guiding thread for the rest of the lectures that make up this podcast as we move from this portion of Genesis all the way through Joshua. And the big question is, how does God create? What is it that he does to create his people Israel? We're going to see that as we saw in Genesis 1, where God makes a place and then has inhabitants for the place, we see a very similar dynamic going on here in the story of the creation of Israel. So as God creates the seas and puts the fish in the sea, and as God creates the sky and puts the birds in the sky, here he has the idea of a place, the promised land, and then he has a people for that place, the people of Israel, his people, his chosen people, who will go into that place. So we'll see that dynamic repeat itself, as we saw in Genesis 1, in the big story that we're about to begin to follow. As we move through this larger story of the creation of Israel, we're going to go through it in two phases. The first phase is the patriarchal story, and that will take us from Abraham through Jacob and Joseph to the end of Genesis, essentially. And at this point, the people of Israel are basically a family, a small family at the beginning and a larger growing family by the end, by the time they arrive in Egypt. The second part of our story will be the national narrative, where Israel is no longer just a family, but is several 100,000 people, so that we can at least think of them in terms of the number of their population as being on the level of a nation as opposed to a family. And so from the opening of Exodus until they arrive in the promised land, we will be addressing them as a nation. So on the first part, you have the patriarchal narrative. In the second part, you have the national narrative. And so we'll walk through these two phases as we go through the story of God's creation of his people. In addition to that, I want to pay attention to a theme that we saw in Genesis 1 and how it is transformed in the course of the story of the creation of Israel. That theme has to do with the freedom moments that we saw in the creation of the cosmos. There were two of these. So the first of them came at the very beginning. The first of them was formless matter. Before God makes all of the different spheres and before he populates them, you have the earth as formless and void. And the way that I described this at the time was as a kind of pure possibility of being, something that does not have form yet, that is a kind of mist, as it were. But it is a pure freedom because it is not limited by any particular kind of form. And so we have this at the very beginning, arguably before even the first day, before there is light. At the end of the creation in Genesis chapter 1, we encounter another freedom, and that is the freedom of man. The free will of Adam and Eve. They could choose what is good and right. They can choose what is righteous. They can choose to dwell in the presence of God, or they can choose pride. They can choose sin and falling away from God. And even though this free will is couched within an inclination towards the good, after all, they can be thankful for all the things that God has given them, and the form that God has given them bears the image of God. That's a good thing. So even though there is this goodness all around them, there's a real possibility that they could choose against that goodness and choose what is evil, which sadly we know to have been the case, with the curse of death coming on all of us as a result. So there's freedom at the beginning of the creation with formless matter, and a freedom that comes at the end of the creation with free will. And we're going to see really strangely how these moments of freedom that happened there in the creation in Genesis 1, before the fall, after the fall, in the creation of God's people, Israel, become near-death moments. At several times during the story of the creation of Israel, God's people almost dies. They come very, very close to death. And this is really, I think, one of the fascinating things about how God creates his people. It's not a very direct and linear kind of creation. It's not as though God says to Abram, I've got a land for you, go to it. The land is unpopulated. He goes to it, and they live happily ever after, having a large family until they become a nation. A very simple kind of story. Instead of that, we have a very roundabout kind of story. One where the people nearly dies or endures a tremendous amount of pressure at several points along the way. And they spend, as those who are familiar with the story know, a great deal of time enslaved in another land, bearing a tremendous amount of pressure there before they get to the promised land. So it's, again, a somewhat circuitous route to get to the promised land as opposed to a direct and easy one, with these multiple instances of near death happening figuratively or literally along the way. And so we'll pay attention to those as we move through the story, as we paint our picture of the broader narrative of how Israel is created. But today we're going to start with Abram, who I will also call Abraham. His name changes a little bit later on in the story. And we're going to focus on those chapters and those selections that have to do with the giving of the covenant and Abraham's importance for the creation of Israel. So we're not going to go through everything in the story of Abraham. I've selected the things that I think are most important, and we'll walk through those and I'll make comments. So let's start with Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Get out of your country, from your kindred and from your father's house, to a land I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. And in you all the tribes of the earth shall be blessed." Then Abram departed as the Lord said to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions, and every soul they acquired in Haran, and they departed for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem as far as the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your seed I will give this land." And there Abram built an altar to the Lord, who appeared to him. So he moved from there to the mountain east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. God promises Abram three things: land, offspring, and blessing. Come to the land I will show you. Go out of your country. There you will go. And I will make of you a great nation. You will have plentiful offspring. And I will bless you and make your name great. And you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. So Abram is promised these three things: that he will have a people who will be his progeny, and those people will have a place, much like we saw in Genesis 1. If there are inhabitants, there's a place. And if there's a place, there are inhabitants for that place. And God also says, "I will give you blessing." So how does Abram respond at 75 years old? The first thing he does is obey. He departs as the Lord had said to him and takes everyone with him: Sarai, his wife, Lot, his nephew, and any others that they have with them. They go and they see the land. So he is at first obedient. And we should note as well that there is faith written into the obedience. If he didn't believe what God had said, he probably would not have gone. But he had faith in God's promise. The second thing is that Abram worships. He builds not one altar at this point in the story, but two. Verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your seed I will give this land." And there Abram built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. And then he moves from there to the mountain east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord. He builds two altars, which means that he spends time in prayer and sacrifice. So the picture that we have of Abram, his initial response to God's commandment and his promise, is obedience on the one hand, going where God tells him to go. Worship on the other, having a habit of prayer and sacrifice. And the faith that is intrinsic in both of these, believing what God has told him. Now, before we move forward, I want to see what St. Ambrose of Milan has to say as he interprets this passage so that we can remember the ways that the fathers would typically read the Old Testament. Here's what St. Ambrose says. Abraham, he writes, represents the mind. In fact, Abraham signifies passage. Therefore, in order that the mind, which in Adam had allowed itself to run to pleasure and to bodily attractions, should turn toward the ideal form of virtue, a wise man has been proposed to us as an example to imitate. Actually, Abraham in Hebrew signifies father, in the sense that the mind, with the authority, the judgment, and the solicitude of a father, governs the entire person. This mind was in Haran, that is, in caverns, subject to different passions. For this reason it is told, go from your country, that is, from your body. From this land went forth the one whose homeland is in the heavens. The exhortation of the fathers here that they see in Abraham, with St. Ambrose speaking for them at this point, is to turn your mind from your body to heavenly things. Abram was already doing this inasmuch as he had a habit of prayer and sacrifice. So let's bear this in mind as we continue through the rest of the story. Now, in the next passage, Abram and Lot see the promised land, and they decide to part ways. Abram goes to one part of the promised land, Lot goes to another. And after they part ways, God appears to Abram a second time. This is chapter 13, verse 14. Then God said to Abram after Lot separated from him, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land you see, I give to you and to your seed forever. And I will make your seed as the dust of the earth, that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your seed also could be numbered. Arise, walk in the land through its length and its breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and went and dwelt by the oak of Mamre in Hebron, and built an altar there to the Lord. This second giving of the covenant promises is a promise of land and offspring. The first time we saw land, offspring, and blessing. This time we see land and offspring. It is a repetition of two of the 3 points in the original promise of the covenant, what God is going to give to Abram in making his people out of Abram's seed. So what does Abram do? Again, he is obedient. He moved his tent and went and dwelt by the oak of Mamre. So he does as God tells him to do. God says, arise and go and walk in the land through its length, and Abram does this. The second thing he does is that he builds an altar. So we see obedience and we see worship. Just as we saw them the first time that Abram received the promise, so now we see them a second time. And implicit in both of these, in obedience and worship, is faith. To pray and to sacrifice is to act in faith. To be obedient is to act in faith. It is there present in both of these as we see it in Abram. So moving on with the story, Lot is captured by enemy tribes, and Abram goes to his rescue and actually rescues him from the tribes and defeats them. And on the way back from defeating these tribes, Abram encounters Melchizedek, who is a unique figure in the Old Testament. And here's the encounter between Abraham and Melchizedek, king of Salem. This is chapter 14, verse 18. Now Melchizedek, the king of Salem, brought out bread and wine to Abraham. He was the priest of God Most High. He blessed Abram and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hands. Then Abram gave him a tithe of all. And so Melchizedek comes out as the priest of God, encounters Abraham, and acts as this priest, blessing Abram and receiving a tithe from him. And there's comment on this in the book of Hebrews that I want to go to so we'll understand the significance of what Melchizedek does. This is St. Paul writing in chapter 7, verse 1. I'm going to read the first few verses of this chapter. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being translated King of Righteousness, then also King of Salem, meaning King of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like the Son of God, remains a priest continually. Now, most persons in the Old Testament who are worthy of note have a genealogy. They are located between all of those who come before and those who come after. So they have a place. They are embedded in a particular historical train of ancestors and then those who come after one. Melchizedek is not like this. The point is that he is without father, without mother, without genealogy, made like the Son of God. One who represents eternity, one who has a timeless origin, remains a priest, St. Paul writes, continually. Picking up in verse 14 of the same chapter, for it is evident that our Lord arose from Judah, of which tribe Moses spoke nothing concerning priesthood, and it is yet far more evident if, in the likeness of Melchizedek, there arises another priest who has come, not according to the law of a fleshly commandment, but according to the power of an endless life. For he testifies, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek represents the endless life that is Christ, and what would be the priesthood of Christ after his death and resurrection. And so Melchizedek represents the eternal, blessing what is happening temporally. He represents that which is timeless, blessing what is happening in time, as Abraham will be the father of the people of Israel. So we see this blessing happening in the midst of God's giving of the covenant on multiple occasions to Abram. This is God's work. God is blessing this man to be the father of his people, to have those people in the land that he has designated for them, and to receive the other blessings that God has also set upon him. And so Melchizedek's blessing represents the kind of the eternal stamp that is happening here, that is on what is happening here to Abram. So we're going to pick up here with chapter 15 now. This is just after Abram meets Melchizedek. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, do not be afraid, Abram. And one wonders what he might have been afraid of at that point. God says, I am your shield and will be your exceedingly great reward. But Abram said, Lord, what would you give me, seeing I go childless? And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus, the son of Masech, my domestic maidservant. Then Abram said, look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, my household servant is my heir. So God has promised him land, offspring, and blessing. And Abram is now saying, I don't have any offspring. Where is the offspring that you promised me? And so when God says, do not be afraid, he's possibly has sensed that fear in Abram and is going to respond to it. Because Abram voices it directly. Where's the offspring you promised me? And immediately the voice of the Lord came to him, saying, this one shall not be your heir, but the one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Then he brought Abram outside and said to him, look now toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to number them. And God said to him, so shall your seed be. And Abram believed God, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. Then God said to him, I am the God who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Master and Lord, how will I know that I will inherit it? Again, how will I know that I will have what you promised to me, Abram says. So God said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So Abram brought all these to him and cut them in half down the middle and placed each opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds in two. And when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. So there's this sort of ceremonial setting that we see here. There's a heifer, a goat, and a ram, all cut in half, with the sides laid opposite each other. Now around sunset, picking up in verse 12, a trance fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. Then God said to Abram, know for certain that your seed will be strangers in a land not their own, and will serve them, and they will afflict and humble them for 400 years. Also the nation they serve I will judge, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. But as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace, buried in a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the sin of the Amorites is not yet filled up. And it came to pass, when the sun went down, that there was a flame, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and lamps of fire that passed between those divided pieces. On the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I will give this land to your seed, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So we have this really fascinating scene. Abram asks this question, how do I know that I shall receive offspring? And God takes him outside and says, count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, so shall your seed be. And Abram believes, and God reckons it to him as righteousness. And we're going to let St. John Chrysostom instruct us in how we should look at this particular verse about Abraham's belief. This is him writing on Genesis 15, verse 6. Accordingly, let us learn, I beseech you, a lesson for ourselves as well as from the patriarch. Let us believe in the words of God and trust in his promise. Let us not apply the yardstick of our own reasoning, but give evidence of deep gratitude. This, you see, will succeed in making us also be seen to be righteous, and will quickly cause us to attain the promise made by him. In Abraham's case, however, the promise was made that a complete multitude would develop from his descendants. The effect of the promise was beyond the limits of nature and human logic. Hence, faith in God won righteousness for him. In other words, Abram can't see exactly how this is going to happen. He just has to believe that it is going to happen in the future. God is going to do it even though he can't see how. And his not seeing how is that he doesn't have an heir yet. He does not have offspring. He does not have a son from his own body. Not at this time. His wife is not pregnant. Time has passed since the original giving of the promise, since it's given twice, actually. But still, he has no heir, and there is no pregnancy. And yet God says, your seed shall be as the stars. And Abraham believes despite the evidence to the contrary that is staring him in the face. This God reckons to him as righteousness. He believes from his heart that he will have this, even though he sees no direct physical support of it, no physical evidence of it at this time. So God reckons it to him as righteousness. Now, what are we to make of this particular ceremony with the animals and with the flame and the smoking oven and the lamps of fire that pass between it, and the promise that we see of his people, of the people that will be the people of Israel being enslaved for 400 years? And what do we make of all this? Well, let's go to St. Augustine of Hippo, who gives an interpretation that he's not alone in having among the fathers, but he's going to talk a little bit about this ceremony. He writes, when it is added, and when the sun was now setting, there was a flame, and lo, a smoking furnace, and lamps of fire, which passed through between those pieces. This signifies that at the end of the world, the carnal shall be judged by fire. So this scene that we're seeing with the animals cut in half and the fire going between them is a kind of judgment scene. The affliction of the city of God, such as never was before, which is expected to take place under Antichrist, was prefigured by Abraham's horror of great darkness about the going down of the sun. When the end of the world draws nigh, so at the going down of the sun, that is, at the very end of the world, there is signified by that fire the day of judgment, which separates the carnal who are to be saved by fire from the carnal who are to be condemned in the fire. And so the halves of the animals on the left and the right represent those who are to be justified and those who are to be condemned, or those who are to be saved and those who are to be condemned. And this is a kind of judgment scene. Now, I would add, as a kind of prefiguring of this judgment at the end of time, that the two halves can very easily represent the judgment of Egypt that is going to happen at the end of the 400 years. So on the one hand, you have those who are condemned, in this case, the Egyptians. And then on the other hand, you have those who are saved, in this case, the Israelites. Because there is a judgment that will happen there, and it is the Egyptians, particularly the Egyptian army and the Egyptian people through the plagues, who will be judged for what they have done, while the Israelites will escape and be born as a people. So we have this understanding of judgment at the end of the world, and I think with a kind of foreshadowing of what's going to happen directly with the Promised Land and the leaving of Egypt to get to the Promised Land. Let's hear from St. Caesarius of Arles, who says something very similar to St. Augustine, but it's worth hearing what he has to say, I think. He writes, "Notice, brothers, that what is called a fiery torch passing between those pieces is also not said to have touched the turtle dove and the pigeon. That evening signified the end of the world. Those animals, as we already said, showed a type of all the nations who believe in Christ, because those nations have in them not only spiritual people, as was already said, that is, not only good people, but even the wicked. For this reason the animals were divided, and the fiery torch passed through them. According to what the apostle says, the day of the Lord will declare it, since it will be revealed in fire, and so forth. That burning, smoking oven and fiery torch prefigured the day of judgment, and for this reason fear and a darksome horror settled upon blessed Abraham." So we see an interpretation of the passage that's very close to what St. Augustine has to say, and locates its significance in judgment, even the judgment at the end of time. So, the promise has been given to Abram 3 times that he shall have land and offspring, and in one case at least, land, offspring, and blessing. Let's move on to chapter 16, where here we will see Abram and Sarai have had 10 years without a child, 10 years without pregnancy. Chapter 16, verse 2. "So Sarai said to Abram, 'See now, the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Go into my maid, perhaps I shall obtain children by her.'" So Sarai says, "I'm not getting pregnant. This is not happening. It's been 10 years since these promises were originally given. So what we're going to do is have you go into your maid and have a child by her." So Abraham obeyed the voice of Sarai, and he goes into Hagar, her maid. And when he goes into Hagar, she conceives. So he went into Hagar, and when she saw that she had conceived, Hagar's mistress, Sarai, became despised in her eyes. She begins to see herself as better because God had blessed her with pregnancy, with a child, whereas Sarai had not been so blessed. Then Sarai said to Abram, "My wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace, and when she saw she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. May God judge between you and me." So Sarai says that she is being wronged by this, and Abram says, "Do with her as you please." And so at this point, Sarai deals harshly with Hagar, and Hagar flees away. While she is out in the wilderness, when she has left Abram and Sarai, the angel of the Lord comes to Hagar, and he says to her, "Return to your mistress and humble yourself under her hand." This is a recognition that Hagar had been proud in doing what she had done. The angel says to her, "I will surely multiply your seed exceedingly, that it may not be counted because of its multitude." The angel says to her, "You shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has taken notice of your humiliation." And it's at this point I want to point out, just to emphasize, how God recognizes those who are humble. Had Hagar been proud? Yes, she had been proud. But her humiliation was such that God had compassion on her. And he said to her, "Go back and humble yourself." And so this is what she does. She returns to her home. She humbles herself below Sarai, and she gives birth to Ishmael. Ishmael is born when Abram is 86 years old. So it's been 11 years since the original giving of the promise. 13 years later, when Abram is 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, this is chapter 17, verse 1, "I am your God, be pleasing before me and be blameless. I will establish my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly." Then Abram fell on his face, and God talked with him, saying, "As for me, behold, my covenant is with you. You shall be a father of many nations." No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make nations of you, and kings shall come from you. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your seed after you and their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be your God and the God of your seed after you. Also, I will give you and your seed after you the land you are occupying as a sojourner, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. I will multiply you exceedingly. I will give you offspring, and I will give you land. Here the promise is made a fourth time. 4 times the promise is given. And God says to Abraham, "This is the covenant you shall keep between me and you and your seed after you throughout their generations. Every male child among you shall be circumcised. A child of 8 days old shall be circumcised by you." This is the first stipulation that we have for membership in the covenant. Verse 14, "And the uncircumcised male child who is not of circumcision in the flesh of his foreskin on the 8th day, that soul shall be cut off from his people, for he has broken my covenant." Up to this point, there is nothing that has been mentioned by God that breaks the covenant. Here, if you are not circumcised, you cut yourself off from God's covenant. So there's kind of line that is drawn for what it means to be a member of this covenant. Verse 15, "Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. And I will bless her and also give you a son by her. And I will bless him, and he shall become nations, and kings of peoples shall be from him." So here we have the promise of a child by Sarah. This is the first time that there's a promise of a child directly by her. They probably assumed back at the beginning that if he was going to have an heir, it would be from Sarah. But things didn't work out that way. So Sarah suggested, "Why don't you go into Hagar?" And so he does, and Ishmael is conceived and born. But now, 24 years after the original promise, God says to Abraham, "Sarah, your wife, will have the child who will be your heir." And what is Abraham's response? Verse 17, "Abraham fell on his face and laughed, and said in his mind, 'Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? And shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child?' And Abraham said to God, 'Oh, that Ishmael might live before you.' Then God said, 'No, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac, and I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant.' So God finished talking with Abraham and departed with him." God even says that Isaac will be born this time next year. And then he departs, then he stops talking with Abram. Abraham has now received the promise of an heir in a way that he did not expect. Arguably, after the birth of Ishmael, he thinks Ishmael is his heir. He thinks all of the promises are going to come about through Ishmael. But God throws him what we might call a pretty big curveball at age 99 and says, "No, your wife is going to get pregnant. She is the one who will give birth to your heir. You shall name him Isaac." And Abraham doesn't really believe at this point. He laughs. Shall this really happen? Is it really going to happen this way? And God says, yes, most certainly it will. A little bit later, Sarah hears of the same promise, and she also laughs. This is chapter 18, verse 12. "Sarah laughed within herself, saying, 'I have not yet had a child until now, and my Lord is old also.' The Lord even asks Abraham, 'Why did Sarah laugh within herself, saying, "Surely I shall bear a child, since I am old"? Is anything impossible with God? At the appointed time I will return to you according to the time of life, and Sarah shall have a son.'" So he promises them in their old age that what will happen is what they thought was impossible. They didn't think it was possible to be that age and have a child, but God says, "No, you will have a child. This is how the covenant will be fulfilled, through this heir." Skipping forward a bit. Here we're in chapter 20. Abraham dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and sojourned among the Gerarites. And at this time Abraham said of Sarah his wife, she is my sister. For he was afraid to say among the Gerarites, she is my wife, lest at a given time the men of the city should kill him because of her, because she was beautiful, and they would take her from him, kill him, and make her the wife of the king. Now Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah, but God came to Abimelech in a dream by night and said, indeed, you are a dead man because of the woman you have taken, for she is a man's wife. So Abimelech doesn't realize that he's doing wrong, but it's revealed to him in a dream that he is. Chapter 20, verse 4. Now Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, O Lord, will you destroy an ignorant and just nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And did she not say to me, he is my brother? Then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know you did this with a clean heart, and I spared you that you might not sin against me. Therefore I did not allow you to touch her. Now therefore restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you, and you shall live. But if you do not return to her, rest assured you shall die, you and all who are yours. So Abraham is the prophet, and God tells Abimelech, get him to pray for you. A little bit later on in this same story, chapter 20, verse 15, Abimelech said to Abraham, see, my land is before you, dwell where it pleases you. Then to Sarah he said, behold, I have given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver, that's Abraham, which will vindicate your honor before all those with you. So Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants. Then they bore children, for the Lord closed up all the wombs of the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. What I want to draw home here is that Abraham is one who prays. He's even said to be a prophet, in this case, one who has access to God's presence and his plans and purposes. But God says to Abimelech, get Abraham to pray for you. You do this, and you shall live. And Abraham prays to God for Abimelech, and the wombs of his women which had been closed are now opened. The point here is that Abraham prays, that prayer is part of his life. We saw earlier when he was receiving the covenant that Abraham built altars numerous times. He's quite the altar builder. He worships regularly. And here we see him as a prophet later on, 24 years later. God is saying to Abimelech, go and get him to pray. Abraham's life is wrapped up in prayer. When we think of him in relation to all of these appearances that God has made to him, all the times that God comes to him, well, when and how does God come to him? What's necessary for God to come to him in this way? Abraham has already opened himself to God by his life of prayer. It is implied in God coming to Abraham that Abraham has set himself apart by prayer to welcome the presence of God. If we are to learn anything about Abraham as a model for us at this time, it's that his mind is turned to heavenly things. And how does that happen? It happens through the practice of prayer that has been part of Abraham's life. Now, we don't know exactly when God came to Abraham. It's not told to us that he was in prayer. But I would venture to say, as an Orthodox Christian, that if God is going to appear to someone, very often he will appear while that person is in prayer. When that person has set aside earthly things, put aside worldly cares, in order to be in the presence of God. One of the broader points of this podcast is the idea of the new man. Now, what is the new man? If we're not to be about the things that this world gives us and the things that Western civilization has valued, if we're actually going to be people who have a different orientation, what does that orientation look like? If Abraham is our example, that orientation looks like a daily striving to be in the presence of God, in prayer. It means that we rest in God in prayer. That we may not have altars in our homes, but we have icon corners if we're Orthodox. That's our altar. Go there and pray. Make it a habit. Turn yourself to God. Do it regularly. Abraham was constantly building altars. And 24 years later, he was known by God as a prophet, as one who prays and to whom God listens when he prays. If we are to rest, if rest is what is holy to us, that rest is first and foremost in God. And the practice of that rest is prayer. So Abraham prays to God for Abimelech, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants, and they bore children. Now it's after this, when Abraham was 100 years old, that his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh. All who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I have borne a child in my old age. And so the heir is born. It looks as though the promise is on the way of being fulfilled. And here we have, following this, one of the most striking passages in the Old Testament. The first of the death moments that we see, or the near-death moments that we see on the way to God's creation of Israel, the near sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, the testing of Abraham's faith. We'll start here in chapter 22, verse 1. Now it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham, and he said to him, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. Then he said, Take now your beloved son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a whole burnt offering on one of the mountains, I tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, and saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son. And he split the firewood for the whole burnt offering, and arose and went to the place God told him. Then on the 3rd day Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off. Thus Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The lad and I will go yonder and worship, and we will come back to you. At several points, God has given Abraham a command. Go and see the land that I will give you, for example. Here he says, Take your beloved son and sacrifice him. Abraham has built altars in several places. Now, after the birth of his own son by his wife, who will be the heir, he's going to build an altar and lay his own son on it. Verse 6 of chapter 22. So Abraham took the firewood of the whole burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. Then he took the fire in his hand and a knife, and the 2 of them went together. Then Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father. And he said, Here I am, my son. Then Isaac said, Look, the fire and the firewood, but where is the sheep for a whole burnt offering? And Abraham said, My son, God will provide for himself the sheep for a whole burnt offering. So the 2 of them went together. Then they came to the place where God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and placed the firewood in order. And he bound Isaac his son hand and foot and laid him on the altar upon the firewood. And at this point, the entire people of Israel is there in Isaac's loins. The promise is there in Isaac's loins. Then Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. And one imagines the knife raised up 3 feet from the young man who senses that he is about to die, and who is perhaps shivering already with this notion that the knife is about to be plunged into his chest. And at this critical moment, just before the downward stroke, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So he said, Here I am. And Abraham then replied, the angel then replied, Do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know you fear God, since for my sake you have not spared your beloved son. Then Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him, a ram was caught in a thicket by its horns. So he brought it for a whole burnt offering in the place of his son. Thus Abraham called the name of the place, The Lord has appeared, and it was as it is said to this day, in the mountain the Lord was seen. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time out of heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you did this thing, and for my sake did not spare your beloved son, I will certainly bless you, and assuredly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven and as the sand on the seashore, and your seed shall inherit the cities of their enemies. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you obeyed my voice. So Abraham returned to his servants, and they rose and went together to the well of oath, and Abraham dwelt at the well of oath. So there's a couple of points that I want to make here. The first has to do with the nature of the faith of Abraham, which is actually explained to us in Hebrews. This is chapter 11, verse 17. St. Paul says to us, By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, In Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. Abraham's faith was that even if Isaac died, Isaac would return to life and the promise would be fulfilled. The promise of land, offspring, and blessing, here particularly offspring through Isaac, would not go unfulfilled. That promise had been given 4 times prior to God commanding Abraham to sacrifice his son. And Abraham believes through this command that flies in the face of all the promises, through this command, if he is obedient to it, God will still bring about his word. This is the faith that is so miraculous, the faith that is so stupefying in some ways, and yet the faith that says God will be true to his word, he will bring this about, despite all evidence to the contrary. Earlier, Abraham had said to God, You said you would give me offspring. Where's my offspring? In chapter 15. I don't have offspring yet. That's the evidence that flies in the face of what you have promised me. And then God says, takes him outside and he says, Look at the stars. As many as the stars are, so shall your offspring be. And Abraham believes. And here in this case, there is a command that moves against the grain of the promise. Take your son, who is the heir, through whom you will be the father of many nations, and this one nation, Israel. Take your son, the heir, and kill him. And despite that piece of evidence, that particular command, Abraham still believes. That is his faith. The second point that I want to draw out here is the causality in Abraham's action. This is chapter 22, verse 16. The angel of the Lord says, By myself I have sworn, says the Lord, because you did this thing, and for my sake did not spare your beloved son, I will certainly bless you and assuredly multiply your seed. Now, up to this point, God has given the promise many times. We saw 4 times, but each time God just gives it. It's not because of something that Abraham has done. But here, because Abraham has passed the test, God says, I will do these things because you have done this. And this should give us some idea about how it is that we in our free will and in our effort are supposed to work with God. It is ultimately God's plan, ultimately God's purpose to make the people of Israel, but it is not without Abraham's cooperation. That cooperation plays the smaller part. 4 times God says, I'm going to bless you this way. And Abraham doesn't have to do anything like this. Abraham certainly doesn't have to go and potentially sacrifice his son. At no point during those 4 times that the covenant is given does God say, because you did this, I will bless you. But for those 4 times that God says, I will bless you with land and offspring, and additional blessing in some instances, but for those 4 times that God simply says it, there is this one time that God says to Abraham, because you have done this, I will bless you. Not without your effort, Abraham, will you be blessed. Not without your passing the test of faith. Not without your obedience. Not without your worship. The same could be said for us of salvation, that the entire context, the entire motivation and initiative, the entire story really belongs to God and his action. God says, I will give you this. I will bless you in this way. But he also says, not without your cooperation, not without your struggle, not without your passing the test of faith, not without your seeking me in obedience and in sacrifice. And so God's part is by far the larger part, and our part is the smaller part. But God has that part, and we have our smaller part. At this point, God is going to create his people Israel, and we see the first time that they almost die, that they almost perish, all of them, with Isaac in his loins on the altar. And yet they are saved at the very last moment. We'll see this kind of event again, not necessarily with this level of intensity, but we will see the people almost perish and then be, as it were, resurrected, brought back to life in one way or another, bearing through these very harsh and difficult circumstances, things that would kill them if not for the grace of God. So we'll keep an eye on that as we move forward. In the next episode, we'll be going over the story of Jacob. See you all then.
The Old Testament and the New Man, Genesis through Joshua with Dr. Daniel Cantey. Dr. Cantey taught religion and philosophy at Bethel University from 2012 to 2019. He is a graduate of Yale Divinity School and Emory University and lives with his family in Clarksville, Tennessee. This has been a listener and viewer-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.